welcome to Philoxenia tonight under these extraordinary circumstances. It is so strange for me to be back after half a year now. The last time I was sitting here on the 9th of March presenting the book of Jonathan Coe, the German edition of his Brexit book, Middle England. And we were sitting here and it was clear that something big was coming.
Happening.
And we were all, of course, not clear what it would be, how it would change all our lives. And now, half a year later, we are back. At least I am back for one event, because I have to quarantine 14 days afterwards coming back to London, because the UK put Austria on the list of dangerous countries. I think there are new infections in this country a little bit above 1,000 per day, while in the UK, your home country, your old home country, and my new home country, there are 17,000 new infections every day. So I'm not quite sure how this in relation works out, but we will have probably quite big difficulties to travel in the near future again, and we will have to see how we can deal with it. The great pleasure, though, is that we can be here tonight, and then we have Alison Smale as a very, very special guest. And it's really lucky that between New York, Athens, and Vienna, we caught you to come here for one talk, because, let me introduce you, Alison. She's a British journalist. I think we've met in 1989 or 90 when you were covering from Vienna.
The fall of communism.
The fall of communism. You covered the Balkan Wars. You covered the first democratic elections in all of our neighboring countries.
Yes.
At the time for the Associated Press.
Exactly.
And what was for me very impressive was to watch how Alison became not only one of the best journalists and foreign reporters I've ever met, but she became also successful editor in the New York Times and rose to higher functions, which as a woman, of course, is always a particular pleasure to see. You were the executive editor of the International Herald Tribune in the years in Paris.
Yes.
And then also bureau chief of the New York Times in Berlin up to 2013. But before
2017.
17, sorry.
Yeah.
From 2013 to 2017. But you also spent years in New York before that, watching 9/11 basically from the office window.
Yes, kind of.
Kind of. And you now, in the past 2 years, have worked at the United Nations as under General Secretary responsible for communication. What we would want to discuss tonight is, as we said in our title, the freedom of press under pressure, which Alison has seen now in her career over 30 years, between Eastern Europe and Western Europe and the Western world in general. But we were thinking maybe to start not there where we are now in Vienna and neighboring Eastern Europe, but with the new center of darkness for the press and the media, which is the White House. And with a president who is now fighting for his re-election, by tweeting frantically, although he currently has COVID.
Yes.
And so I would like to start asking you, Alison, how you, as a longtime member of the New York Times editorial office, have seen this unprecedented deterioration between an administration, a White House, and the so-called established liberal media in the United States.
Just a small topic like that.
Just like this.
Thank you, Tessa, for such a warm and generous introduction, and thank you very much for inviting me to come here. It's really wonderful to be back in these rooms again, which I've only seen once before, so thank you. Now, that's a cover for having forgotten what your exact question is, but basically, I think you want to know how we got to this state where relations between the media and the White House have deteriorated sharply. I think it's clear that this is something that results from the extraordinary occupant of the White House. We all knew when Donald Trump unexpectedly won the election in 2016 that we would probably be in for something pretty unusual. I'm not sure that any of us guessed at the scope. And I think what we will now be spending some time doing is trying to assess, in the light of whether Trump wins a second term or he doesn't, what occurred during the first term and how has it affected both international and national politics. I think it's very clear that the current occupant of the White House is a man with a very large sense of himself, and we see somebody who is, self-centered and even more so than most political leaders. Certainly, all sorts of things have been unusual, and here we are in a situation which sums up pretty much how unusual that is. And that is that the White House, the incumbent at the White House, is fighting now the campaign whilst he is also ailing with a potentially deadly disease, which we certainly hope he and others do not succumb to. But it is definitely a point where it means he's communicating, as you say, via tweets, via snatches of broadcasts with friendly powers, and this is very much different from the traditional role that we would see in the last weeks of a US presidential campaign. I think that it's going to probably be one that historians chew over for the ages, but for the moment our main job is to get out there and report what is happening day by day and trying to make sure that people understand the magnitude of the choice that they have. If I can say that slightly sort of patronizing way, which isn't intended to be patronizing.
But this is the big problem also. I mean, there is such an abyss between the administration and most media now that is not in support of Trump, and these two camps are look at each other, and it has become impossible to even talk to each other. I mean, your publisher, Mr. Sulzberger, said recently that Trump was putting lives at risk by his politics, by his presidency. Is that even, after something, if somebody talks like this to each other, can you then still report on an administration at all?
I mean, I think it's a very good question. I think, as I say, we have to be true to ourselves. We have to make sure that we are conveying the depth of the difference between this and other situations in the past. So I think it's also should be noted that relations between the White House and the media press corps have been on a long deterioration. And it was not actually, when Trump was elected, it was a shock. But there were plenty of reporters who had experience of covering him in the past, most particularly Maggie Haberman, who worked for New York tabloids and covered Trump in that incarnation. And that gave her more access to the president when he was first elected. I think now, I honestly don't know what the situation is, but I think we can judge by the paucity of interviews between Trump and anybody who is likely to oppose him to say that he has, narrowed the field upon which you can have this debate. I think that's a pity for democracy, and it is a pity if it becomes an example that others might copy. But what we really have to do is to concentrate on the last weeks of the campaign now and see that we try to bring off something that still can be declared an exercise in democracy.
I mean, one of the terms that he came up with very early in his administration was to call everything fake news, which he didn't like. I mean, that set the tone, didn't it?
Well, I think basically the fake news thing sort of traced a path out of this little town Veles in Macedonia, where people were posting in the guise of being people on genuine voters and creating a whole string of Facebook posts that suggested that there were people ready to vote for Trump where there perhaps weren't. So the fake news term did not actually, I think, originate with Trump, but it was something that he took up. And I just think that we have to be very careful in using language anyway. I mean, this is what we have to define our actions, make them different from those of animals. And we really care about, if we care about language, just look at the phrase fake news. If it's fake, it really can't be news, and if it's news, it can't be fake. So I think it's very important not to take up every phrase that is tossed out in this process, and that's a big one of them. We will hurt ourselves more than anybody else if that's how we come to view the whole process. So, I mean, I think Donald Trump adopted even fake news awards, but I think even he had slight tongue-in-cheek when he spoke of these.
Well, you never know exactly what he takes serious or what not.
True.
But if you think that when it was announced that he tested positive with COVID, and you had a look at Twitter, and you realized that immediately there was a complete, in all camps, there was conspiracy theories were spilling out all over, and my first thought was like, okay, he just wants to get out of the next TV debate or something like that. The fact that we all entertained these thoughts also, I think, shows how far the trust in what we're being told by this administration has eroded.
Yes, I mean, eroding trust, I think, is basically the motto that you could hang over all of to describe events that have unfurled over the last 3 to 4 years. And it will be very interesting to see if it's possible to, I don't think it's possible to return to the status quo ante, no matter what the outcome is, because a lot of very tough things have been said by a lot of people in different camps. And it is, you know, a discourse that has therefore opened up a separate line of questioning, which is what is democracy, and how do we return to an agreed vision of what that is. I'm not so sure it'll be easy.
In terms of media responsibility, do you think that the so-called liberal media made a mistake to, you know, pick up the provocation so easily?
Well, I don't know. I think you have to report what you see, and that is what there was to say. Then I think you can have a long debate about the role of the vaunted objectivity of the American press and some other media in other countries. I think it's going to be very hard, as I say, to establish a common basis again. But hopefully there will be a result that allows us all to start doing that. But that's what we don't know.
I mean, it seemed to me that over the last month, suddenly the critical interviews with Donald Trump were not made by the New York Times, who has lost access, but by people in Fox News. There was a certain shift either because Trump becomes more erratic every day, so that even his own media camp is becoming nervous and says, like, you can't just say such utter nonsense live on camera in the middle of an interview. Is it this, or?
I mean, I don't have a sort of secret path into the deliberations of what gets on Fox, but I think there has been something of a change of tone, and probably that reflects deliberations by journalists who, at the end of the day, have to answer to their face in the mirror and a lot of other people for what they do to earn a living. So it is tricky. I think also that certainly since the announcement that President Trump was suffering from COVID, it's not clear to what degree he has consulted with anybody, his doctors, for instance. There's a fly gate.
It's a fly again. So like Pence sent over his last remaining fly. No, it's not a wasp. No, it's a small thing. Not important. And it moves, not unlike the one of Pence.
Right. So anyway, I just think that it's interesting to observe the change in tone, but who knows what it actually means unless we're round the editorial tables in different media organizations, we can't say, and that's as it should be.
Yeah, I mean, if you see how he's tweeting today that he wants to go back and campaign immediately in Florida and in Pennsylvania because the polls are showing a widening lead, a widening gap between the candidates, and a bigger and bigger lead for Joe Biden now, up to 10 to 13%. So clearly the president becomes more and more desperate. But I wonder, one thing that I thought was really interesting in these debates, in this first debate, was how little authority he can take from a moderator, from someone who chairs this debate. Journalists, for him, I think, don't count at all as a professional sort of item, and he doesn't understand that he should actually sort of behave according to some rules.
I really do wonder to what extent it was a purposeful strategy that he appeared with at the first debate, because he really was kind of pacing the stage and barely letting Biden finish a sentence from the very get-go. So it's very hard for all of us to deal with trying to analyze these moves, which are not part of the normal political discourse and not part of what we would regard as logical ways to pursue goals. I think this is another part of the whole issue of the role of media and the fate of democracy, and it goes far beyond the scope of a TV debate, but that debate showed us how difficult it is to have a discourse if somebody shifts the sort of area of the playpen, as it were.
It's also that we've seen in the last years, and not only in the States, that spin doctoring and message control has become sort of an established instrument of conveying politics to the people. And these, huge new media departments in ministries and prime ministers' offices, which spit out short messages, in Britain usually 3 words, like build back better is the newest one that we have in the UK now. Which are sort of very much controlled and leave little room for debate. And it makes it extraordinarily difficult for traditional media, which is shrinking in size and shrinking in finances, to actually put up this fight against spin-doctored message control politics pouring down on us. How did you see this development in the last years also, if you take the example of Trump and the New York Times?
I mean, I definitely think it's not restricted to Trump and the New York Times, but obviously there is an increasing perception in government circles anyway that you have to ram home your message, and this has been something that has been done by many rulers throughout the centuries and millennia of history. And in the sense that you are going to put all the force you can to try and convince people of your point of view, this is nothing new. But what I think we're all feeling is that because, for instance, digital technology allows you to analyze very quickly exactly where is a certain policy resonating with whom, how old are these people, is anything about their behavior sort of something that you can extend to other spheres. So I do think it's clear that governments, of course, can summon up resources. They are subject to controls if there's a democratic system and there's some kind of accountability, both in the political system and in the media. I think that we definitely have not seen the death of that. But you're right that traditional media in many countries are not making money. They don't have the resources to throw at these problems, and it is getting harder and harder to get the message across that there might be something fishy here, and it's worth investigating. The New York Times, thanks also to a wonderful growth in its digital subscriptions, does have money at its disposal. I'm sure they would not like to think that there's overly much of it, but they are able to undertake the most fantastic investigative efforts. But it's very, very hard to do. You need the backing of owners, and we've seen ownerships change, but for instance, Jeff Bezos taking over at the Washington Post enabled the Washington Post to hire a lot of reporters, and that immediately heightened the competition between the New York Times and the Washington Post, particularly in Washington itself, for getting the story and really uncovering new details. So that is very, very important. But I think it's also up to us to keep an eye on how do we see governments putting out their point of view. And it's not just a phenomenon that, in Eastern Europe, for instance, you might say, but look at what the Poles and the Hungarians are doing. It's actually much more subtle to examine the reasons behind this and how much support or non-support these policies do gain. And you have in Western Europe also efforts to influence the message, of course. I mean, a state government broadcasting institution exists for a purpose, and one of those purposes is to explain or propagate the policies of the particular government. This is not a surprise.
Well, the difference maybe nowadays is that we were used, the way we grew up, in more or less Western Europe, if we can call Austria part of Western Europe, and you grew up in the UK with a very strong broadcasting corporation that was the model for basically every free media institution in the world. And we were used to having good states. We thought in that part of the world where we grew up that the state exists to help us to preserve our freedom of speech also. This is the problem that suddenly also in the West sometimes we have governments where we think they might put more pressure to limit the freedom of media.
Well, I mean, yes. I don't find it that surprising that this development has occurred. I think one thing that did surprise us all, if we go back to the end of the Cold War and the fall of communism at the end of the 1980s, is that many of us, both here and in the affected countries, thought, this is it, we've done it. The wall fell, our way of thinking prevailed, and therefore the media will be sort of created in the image of that thinking. And that really didn't happen and was probably a mistake, largely to be laid at our door in being sort of slightly naive and not taking an all-encompassing view of what markets would do to media, what the distribution of financial resources would do to media, what the desire would be amongst thinking people to make media work rather than go into business and make money. I was just today recalling an example of one particular East European country where a friend of mine was one of a group of journalists who had taken over their publishing groups, various media, and really improved them and really produced a daily and a weekly that, really sort of spurred debate in the society. It became very successful, so successful that the German group Westdeutsche Allgemeine was interested in acquiring it. And what happened to my friend, who was the only woman involved in this negotiation on the side of the East Europeans, was that she really was against selling, and she wanted it to continue to be reflective of her country. But all the guys who were in the same meeting, they wanted to drive fast cars and make fortunes like their friends who'd gone into business. And so they agreed to the sale of this publication, which it's not that it became terrible, it just was no longer the product of that particular country. And I think that was where an awful lot of debate quickly meant that things tended to move as the governments wanted them to, because they wanted to get rich quick. They didn't really understand how important it was to have it fixed as to what you want to say. And so I think that, many things could have turned out differently if there'd been more understanding also in the West that this was a thoroughly new undertaking, and there were no examples that really could be waved in front of former communist countries. I mean, it wasn't as if, I don't know, not everybody probably would have had the resources to do something like a Financial Times. We did see Hospodářské noviny make various advances in the Czech Republic. But it's really hard to change things quickly, and especially when there's also this pressure to make a profit, which was a totally unknown way of working in many places in Europe.
But definitely, it goes all together, all the institutions that were developed, and there was young democracies trying to establish free media, but also independent courts, independent political parties, governments that followed sort of the rule of law rather than the rule of an ideology or the rule of some kind of corrupt mafia gang. And all these things went in some countries better and in other countries. But so the media, for example, in Poland and in Hungary, which we all watch with horror, is being put under the thumb of the rather authoritarian governments. In Poland less than in Hungary, but in Poland the situation is bad enough. And I think if you look at the index of press freedom of Reporters Without Borders, Poland has slipped to the 62nd place, and Hungary is now on the 89th out of 180 countries. And this all happened within the last 10 years, in particular in the last 5 years, that all these hopes of independent free media is being crushed in front of our eyes. And when you were there in 1989, in 1990, 91, with a young Viktor Orban in Hungary, gearing up as a young student politician and going into politics with Fidesz. And I remember I was also at the first free elections in Hungary, and he was sitting there, he was speaking, you had the feeling this is the hope. And the hope now seems to be gone. And is it not also because, could the media have put up more of a fight if the politics go so authoritarian?
Well, I think it also depends. You have to watch how this happens. And in Hungary, for instance, the government domination of the media is primarily achieved through control of the advertising revenue. And you can say, well, here's a company that is taking care of that. And there's no particular proof that it serves some nefarious political purpose. And there's no specific proof of somebody in the government pulling strings. So it is a very subtle and difficult thing to say. I mean, we should note that, for instance, in Poland, we talk about the lack of freedom, but the presidential election last year was a very close-run thing. I think it was a well-run democratic exercise, which, one would have to go into minute detail to analyze where did things stray from which vision of democracy. So I really like not to sort of join easy statements that say what's happening in Hungary and Poland is terrible. I think it bears vigilance, and clearly they have slipped in the standards by the index, applied by the index. But at the same time, I'm not sure that it's really our position to tell or to suggest that we know better what would best suit Hungary and Poland. I mean, vigilance is required and is definitely a good thing. But at the same time, it's very easy to stray into being sort of slightly arrogant and slightly neglectful of other places.
Well, I mean, we have certainly enough problems in our own countries, clearly. We just had in Austria a government up till the Ibiza Gate case where the power of the ORF, of the Austrian television, was immediately under severe attack. And independent anchor men like Armin Wolf and other colleagues were severely attacked and really threatened in being able to do their job correctly. We have it now in the UK since this government took over. On the first day, on the 13th of December, the attacks on the BBC started because it was supposedly had underestimated the anger of the people in the country, and all sorts of things, which are always the same slogans of populist governments, which just don't like critical media. So of course we shouldn't be arrogant and explain to other people, but in general we can see in Hungary that these media outlets are being closed down and brought under control of Viktor Orban, and I think it's our duty to protest against it.
No, it's definitely our duty, and particularly as journalists, to speak out against abuses of the power, that is special power that is given to media and to government to mould a message. No question about it.
Mm. I mean, the cases in Poland, as you say, that the government is not very secure, and this is why Jarosław Kaczynski now came in this week as deputy prime minister in order to support the Law and Order party, because he cannot be sure that the majority is stable enough. So for sure, it's especially in Poland, there's no way that we need to give up the fight. But the question would also be how media in Poland and in Hungary can be supported. I mean, look at the case of Slovakia, where Jan Kuciak was murdered 2 years ago, and even if there were huge protests in the street, first of all, he was dead, and people are very, very scared.
And his fiancée was
and his
dead,
fiancée was dead also.
Absolutely nothing to do with this.
And this is like 40 minutes from here, yeah? So I think the responsibility that we all as colleagues also have should be to ask what we can do.
Absolutely, and to be as active as possible, since we have countless examples, and we've discussed them here with our opening discussion on Washington, of how things, can go bad pretty easily if we don't speak up.
I mean, what you did in the last 2 years in the United Nations was sort of a very admirable attempt to to modernize the communications department, where you try to, in a multinational organization like this, where all these different cultures also of how to communicate, how to send, to represent politics that the UN wants to be shown to the world. So you tried to modernize it. How difficult was it? Because this could be also a case model for many other organizations.
Yes, although I think there is nothing quite like the United Nations, also in this sort of tremendous variety of views that it has to, as an institution, balance against each other. And I think we can all be very happy that the UN Food Programme won the Nobel Peace Prize today.
Yeah, apropos.
We have and something very good to trumpet from the United Nations. And I would say that, I joined in, 2017, with the idea that Guterres, who had just been chosen as the Secretary General, he was very keen on reforming the institution, and he certainly made that the watchword of his pitch for the job and his conduct of the job when he was in, now that he's been in office for almost 5 years, not quite. So it was definitely something that he wanted done, and you don't get things done at the United Nations unless you are seen to have the backing of fairly senior people. One thing I did was actually just change the name of the department. You wouldn't believe how many meetings it took to achieve that, but the old name was the Department of Public Information, which just smacked of another era. Something that was about global communications suggests a much more global approach, and communications in themselves are, of course, a two-way process. So it became less like sort of Moses with the tablets coming down from the mountains and saying, "Thou shalt do this." So I think it was definitely something that was a joy to see when you achieved something. I said all the time at the United Nations that I found it about 1/3 fun, another third fascinating, and another third frustrating. And how things turned out on any given day depended on which mixture of those you were dealing with. But it is an unbelievable institution, and for all the criticism that is directed at it, it has shown itself to be capable of both reform and administrative processes, but also real effects on the ground. I mean, people would starve, more people would starve if the UN Food Programme was not there.
And do you have the feeling that through your department, then through the communications department, you could actually reach a public that doesn't sort of fall asleep with complex sort of
Well,
issues?
I think it
like
depends. That? My successor, Melissa Fleming, has overseen a campaign that sort of it encourages everybody to look at the veracity and whether of any statement that they see or a development that they see. And this verified campaign is something that, can give people a tool to assess different policies and different moves. It's very difficult. I mean, it's much easier to be an autocrat because you don't have to persuade people, you just order them. But that's not the way things get done at the United Nations, obviously. And I think that there's been a move, definitely, over the last 4 or 5 years to try and make the dealings of the UN more transparent and better understood by the people out in the world who actually are paying for this, and they have a right to know what happens.
Before we open the floor to questions, I also want to ask you, because you are here in Vienna not thanks to us, but thanks to the Institut für die Wissenschaft vom Menschen, the Institute for Human Sciences, where you came here for this year now to work on exactly these questions that we have discussed now, also on media in Eastern Europe and Western Europe. And do you think you can sort of apply some of the lessons you learned also at the UN to these very fragile institutions and media outlets in Eastern Europe? Do you expect to be able to just collect information, or also try to influence certain situations,
I think I live to be surprised always, and I'll see what I find as I investigate. But what is important is that people should know that this effort is going on, and I think it's very important not to give up hope. I have a friend, Ann Cooper, who's just completed a very good report on media in Russia, and she had previously been prepared to declare Glasnost pretty much dead. But when she looked a second time in recent months, she came to the conclusion that there were any numbers of examples of journalists in small and less small places in Russia really taking the authorities to task and applying the rules of free media. So I think it's important that we emphasize what good can be done rather than what kind of mistakes I might think I find. I'm there to help people fix those, but not necessarily as I see it, but as they would have it if they can change the way things are done in their particular country.
Well, I totally agree with you. I mean, when I lived in Russia, we would report every month on one more TV station or newspaper being brought on Kremlin line, and it was always this slogan that you write, the last debate program in NTV or any other Russian channel or has been closed down, or the editor has been fired, and now it will all be on Kremlin line. And that went on for years. I mean, it was always the last program, and there was still one other one, and the others came up, and the courage of colleagues in Russia in particular, but all over Eastern Europe under more and more authoritarian political regimes is astonishing. I mean, it is absolutely astonishing. And as you rightly say, in the regions in Russia, where in cities like Yekaterinburg, of course we never hear about them easily in Western Europe, but they are very, very courageous colleagues who work tirelessly to work against the corruption of only the city governments and all these kind of things. So for sure we should never give up hope.
No, definitely not. And let's look at what's happened, for instance, in Khabarovsk, a not well-known city in the far east of Russia. But when the Kremlin and Putin summoned back the popular local governor, people erupted in protest, and they've kept this up for 4 months now, which is not so easy.
Yeah, which is very good. But we also, of course, had just now the case of Alexei Navalny. So if a critic is a little bit too too successful, then he might get first harassed, then poisoned, and subsequently shot. So for him to go back to Russia now, of course, is a high risk of life operation.
Yes, and we shall see how the whole case develops. But what I think is interesting to note, for instance, in the Navalny episode, is that one of the sort of perhaps slightly unsung heroes of the episode is the pilot who decided to land the plane once it was discovered that Navalny was sick. Had he flown straight on to Moscow, maybe something worse would have occurred.
Well, it's also interesting to see how this operation was planned, because while he was in the air, flown back to Moscow, and he was supposed to die in the air, there was also no opportunity for people to tweet, to shoot videos. It went immediately out into the world because they were in the air. So it's also a sign how his own video and social media campaigns that were so successful and have helped him to reach so many millions of young Russians probably made people who tried to kill him think how he can be taken out of operation without being even able to tell the world about it for about 2 hours until they would have landed in Moscow.
I wouldn't presume to kind of second guess what was going through minds in and associated with the Kremlin, but it's clearly an instructive episode in terms of to what lengths are people prepared to go.
Yeah, I mean, if you look over 30 years of reporting, when you started, there was no, internet was just in its infancy, and we didn't have mobile phones. We disappeared somewhere for a day and tried to find a story. We didn't have help where we Googled in 1 second what the name of the president of the local country where we just ended up was because we couldn't. So how do you think it helped us, journalists and reporters in the field, to be so well connected, or is it also the danger that we are not needed anymore because everyone on the street can take a video and send it around?
Well, I mean, I think we definitely are needed. I think we're more needed than ever. We're needed to analyze events. We're needed to present the points of view that we think we come across, not just for readers, but for a general, not just for specific readers, but for a general audience. And very much that by disappearing for long times away from editors, always the enemy of reporters, it was possible for us to kind of turn up new facts and change people's minds about things. I think it was valuable, but I think basically one of the sort of principal values of media is that you have feisty reporters who are pushing hard for their story to get more attention, and you have editors who are safekeeping. Have we really done due diligence on the truth of this? And I think that it doesn't matter whether that was something that happened in an age where we could disappear for a day, nobody could reach us, hallelujah. Whereas now we're reachable all the time, but we have the same obligation to push back if if somebody is trying to drive us into a line of argument or reporting that we don't think is valuable. So I think it's absolutely the same process as it ever was, which is, good reporter goes out, tries to find story, comes back with good story, and tries to persuade editors to run it. Editors are skeptical, and the collective effort is a good one. It's a super result.
That's true. Do we have any questions? We don't have a microphone today, because we are not so many.
No, so we don't use microphones because of...
We don't want to COVID everyone dead. Okay, sorry, yes.
So instead I gave you entertainment by pouring water all over myself.
Yeah, but that doesn't transmit COVID. But when you say that how difficult it has always been to convince editors of a good story. I think one of the problems that we have now also is that the level of shamelessness that populist leaders like Donald Trump or also Boris Johnson have brought out has made us corrupted journalism in a sense also, that people always want the outrageous. So when I, for example, call my editors here at Profil and say like, can we do a story about this and that? Mostly they are saying like, so is there any Boris angle in this? Because Boris Johnson is outrageous, he's funny and charismatic, and he's somehow easier to sell than the usual English politician, who is usually a little bit more subtle in its expression. So how bad is this age of populism for us journalists?
Well, but I think there's always been a pressure to produce a story that will sell better than another story. I mean, I definitely think that's something that is universal to reporting efforts back through the ages. So I don't know. There is a pressure, and it's up to us to find ways to work around that and come up with stories that are really, really interesting, that do not depend on sensationalism. And that sounds very kind of worthy and holier than thou, but it is one way to come up with good copy.
Yeah. But do you think that, for example, if Donald Trump doesn't win the election and is not re-elected, that these 4 years will somehow have a lasting impact on media, or will it just go away like a bad dream?
No, I mean, I really think you can't ever undo events. And there's been enough that has gone on in the last 4 years that people will remember conduct that was unbecoming, and will try to do something to fix it. But the deed itself stands there ready for all to judge. That sounds kind of preachy almost, which is definitely not the intent. I think that's one of the things that's very difficult about debating media issues, because there is a very thin line between this being something that is legitimate to attack and poke holes in, and being seen as being partisan one way or another. And we should have a long debate about the possibility of what do we do to ensure that vaunted quote-unquote objectivity that is certainly prized in American media, but they themselves are encountering a lot of difficulties now in just keeping things profitable and keeping newspapers going. Newspapers and local TV stations in the United States are really responsible for closely monitoring bad behavior and calling officials to account for it. And it's important that we keep those outlets going. So for the first time, you've got the sort of beginnings of a debate in the United States about the degree of maybe that should there be some sort of government support for media, something which was anathema even 10 years ago. But now that people see what happens when there's no watchdog or a reduced watchdog function, there's a lot of serious people debating this.
Well, the American case is always, as you mentioned before, Jeff Bezos, if you have a good oligarch, a good billionaire who puts in, and if he's good in general is another question, but the fact that he could buy a newspaper made it easier for the newspaper to survive, at least at the moment. And this is a very American thing also, that the state doesn't have a big role in subsidizing media. In Europe, we have a bit of a different situation where this is more established.
It is more established, but at the same time, it still remains questionable, and it's difficult for everybody to judge where do you find the middle in this debate.
But it's of course also logical that populist regimes and governments attack the license fees for state television, as if in the first stage of their attack on the power of these corporations. And you have that in the BBC right now, and we will see how this fight ends, and if the BBC will be able to keep being financed by a license fee or not. But I wonder in this, one of the big ideas of populism is sort of the undermining also of traditional institutions like state television or any other state institution. And this lack of trust, which is the result then in these institutions, can become very dangerous for democracy. Do you think that in America we have reached a point of no return, or is this a question if Trump wins or loses?
Well, I think if Trump wins, there's going to be a lot of questioning about what is the next 4 years going to look like. If he loses, that same question persists, but perhaps it's less existentially powerful. So we shall see, which is, the classic way of getting out of answering your question directly. I think that it's also true that the BBC has traditionally enjoyed a certain regard amongst most people in Britain, and now there's been a lot more questioning about to what degree is the BBC the tool of certain government policies or certain groups within the state and broadcasting, and has it sort of quote-unquote kind of justified its existence. I know a lot of people who really don't watch the BBC version of the news and who criticize it to me. I don't share this criticism. I also don't live in the United Kingdom. I watch BBC usually as its international report, which I think is very comprehensive, but also open to endless amounts of, you can dissect things forever, because if you've got a large world to cover, there's always going to be a difference over which things are you going to report and which do you not have time or money for.
Well, of course, and people have different opinions. I mean, the BBC or other so-called liberal media like The Guardian is then being criticized from not only from the right but also from the left. And,
Yes.
You would think a good balance of both criticisms maybe means that it's really, these are good media that are trying to inform the population. But the interesting thing in the last 6 months during the COVID pandemic was that you could see that media like the BBC has risen in popularity with the population, because in times of crisis people fall back on credible news outlets, and it was tested in polls, and it showed that this is the case, which I thought was a point of hope also for people to understand that it's easy sometimes to make up your opinion on this or that politician via Facebook posts, but if it comes to the question of life and death and how many people are actually dying every day in the country because of COVID-19, then people do go to the BBC or other credible media.
Right, and I think also people are looking for very concrete pieces of information. And that's slightly different than sort of salivating over the latest story about somebody's mistress. So that, in a way, it's, if you like, a sort of return to the very basics of what we think we're paying for when we fund organizations like the BBC. And what has also become very clear during this pandemic is that the actions of individual leaders can vary very widely, and they enjoy varying degrees of support in their own countries. And I think there's been a lot of looking over each other's borders and wondering, are they doing it better in country X? This puts politicians on their toes. And so there's been it's kind of an examination of the state of government-funded media, and particularly broadcasting, that perhaps would not have occurred without this pandemic.
Well, just this afternoon, when I was on the way to pick you up, I got an email from WDR, from der Westdeutsche Rundfunk, where they make a yearly polling on the level of trust that their reporting has in the population. And they had very positive results this year due to their reporting and due to COVID-19, which I thought was interesting, because the question of trust was, of course, crucial also in how populations followed measures that were taken to protect people from the virus spreading. And Germany is one of the top examples in the last year, where people had the feeling they were safer, they were better protected by the government. The government was taking measures in a more credible and organized way than in other countries. And so this goes in a way together, that the question of trust in media that is maybe also state-funded, and makes some sense to look at this as an example for the future, maybe.
Maybe. I think it's also because it's something that is a bit more measurable than just an emotional approach about whether you agree, because you're dealing with numbers, and you're dealing with very concrete outcomes. And it will be interesting to see if this effect continues, and also what people think about the way their governments are handling issues. I think we've seen a great readiness to date, particularly in Western Europe and in the United States, to act, to sacrifice, to try and get as clear a picture as possible. How much support there will be for such measures if our lives continue to be quite substantially disrupted over the next 6 months, when it's also winter in the Northern Hemisphere, we shall see.
Well, you're going to New York next week. Will you be there throughout the elections, or will you?
Yes, no, I should be there for the election.
So can you please tweet a lot so that we can get an idea of what's happening?
Well, I can try. I think it's probably smart to look at a lot of different sources as to what's happening. And the most important thing is to watch it closely.
And what is your gut feeling if he wins or loses?
I mean, it's so difficult, because the shock of 2016 and Hillary Clinton's unexpected loss sits incredibly deeply with especially journalists who like to think that they're right about things, and they were proven to be vastly mistaken in this case. So my gut feeling is that there will be an incredible amount of scrutiny, that there will be challenges to various outcomes, but that if things go according to what the polls are showing us now, then it is likely that Joe Biden will be elected as president, or he will emerge as the victor. That perhaps is what one should say. And exactly how that victory then translates into changes for the future, that's the next stage to watch.
Absolutely. I hope you will be back for another talk
I hope so
in a
too.
few months, and we can continue with more optimism and hope, because this could be the outcome at the beginning of November. Thank you very, very much for coming, Alison.
Thank you for listening so intently.
And thank you for everyone else to coming tonight under these circumstances, masks and no masks. And hope to see you soon here. Thank you very much.